At Cypress Bend Plantation, located on the outskirts of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on November 28, 1867, it was Thanksgiving Day in the American South. Inside the grand house, Colonel William Rutledge and his 3 sons were getting ready for the feast. They laughed and toasted with whiskey, eagerly awaiting the golden turkey Esther, the cook, was preparing. However, unbeknownst to them, in the kitchen, pork lard was boiling in a large iron pot, not to cook their dinner, but for them. Within hours, the colonel and his 3 sons would be dead, boiled alive in the same oil that was meant to crisp the turkey. This story begins with a daughter sold, a past denied, and a wound that never healed. Esther stirred the pot slowly, but her eyes never left the big house. Inside, the men were making plans for the future, but outside, Esther was preparing for their end. This is the tale of Esther Carter, the cook who served up revenge on Thanksgiving Day and turned an empire of lies into a boiling disaster. The kitchen at Cypress Bend never slept, especially not the night before Thanksgiving. The air was thick with the smell of cloves, vinegar, and sweat. Esther moved through the kitchen like a shadow, her bare feet quiet on the pinewood floors, her hands working swiftly. But her mind wasn't on the food, it was on the door, the sound of its creaking iron hinges, and the laughter of the men who never bothered to knock. It had been years since they last came, but she could still hear their footsteps as they returned for another feast. The plantation may have changed names after the war, but its spirit remained the same. The South was supposed to be reconstructed, according to the papers, but on this land, once soaked with cane and blood, the old ways lingered. The Rutledge family still ruled. It wasn't called slavery anymore, just labor, with workers paid pennies for long hours and punished with hunger and fists. William Rutledge, now wearing a Union pin on his lapel, sipped bourbon in the big house. His sons, dressed in suits, looked nothing like the boys they once were. Esther remembered their faces from when they were young and the horrible things they did in secret. The eldest, Nathaniel, once dragged a girl by her hair into the cane fields. Thomas, the middle son, used to spit in the food Esther made if it smelled too much like African cooking. The youngest, Silas, had a laugh that could send chills down your spine. He was the one who told Esther, with a grin, that her daughter was sold north for a better life. Esther never saw her child again. Now, 30 years later, the kitchen was quieter, but the memories remained. Outside, a wagon approached, dogs barked in the distance, and boots echoed on the wooden steps. 3 men entered the kitchen, dressed in fine wool coats, full of arrogance. Esther didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the pot. Nathaniel teased her, calling her an old cook, and Thomas snickered about her supposed use of roots and voodoo. Silas remained silent, walking to the table and tracing a carving in the wood. It was a little flower Esther had etched there when her daughter was born. Silas pressed his thumb into the carving with a cold smile and asked, "You ready to feed us, Auntie?" Esther finally met his gaze. For a moment, something passed between them, like a storm gathering in the distance. She replied, "Y'all eating real good this year?" Then, without another word, she returned to the pot, and the oil bubbled louder. Before she was the cook, Esther was just Essie, a young girl in the fields, catching fireflies behind the kitchen house. Her mother, Binta, had come from the coast, bringing with her stories and songs from another time. Binta never cried, she hummed old melodies while she worked. She had taught Essie that when the pot boils, you don't scream. You wait, you watch, and then you feed it what it needs. At the age of 12, Essie witnessed her first scar, not from a whip, but from silence. She saw her father, Jonas, dragged through the sugarcane and tied to the iron cross behind the smokehouse, accused of stealing molasses. They left him there, bleeding for 2 days, and on the 3rd day, Silas Rutledge threw rocks at him. Esther was forced to serve breakfast to the guests that morning, but she didn't cry. She watched. By the time she was 15, Esther was a woman in every way that mattered on the plantation. The kitchen became both her cage and her shield. She was known for her cooking skills. Her hands had the magic touch. But cooking was more than just survival. It was a form of resistance. She learned how to carve meat, blend spices, and use herbs to heal or harm. Above all, she learned how to look a man in the eye and make him believe she was nothing. Esther named her daughter Clara, after the woman who had once tried to escape but failed. Clara was light-skinned, bright-eyed, and full of curiosity. But at the age of 7, Esther received a letter from New Orleans. William Rutledge needed to settle a debt, and Clara was sold into apprenticeship. Esther screamed that night, not in front of the masters, but in the swamp where no one could hear her. She returned to the kitchen, hair soaked and hands bleeding, but she cooked anyway, an intensely spicy stew. No one noticed the difference. Years passed. The war came and went, but nothing changed at Cypress Bend. Slavery may have had a new name, but the hunger for power and control stayed the same. Esther stayed because leaving meant forgetting, and she refused to forget. She fed the men who destroyed her past, seasoning their joy, roasting their cruelty, and reminding herself of what was taken and what could still be given. On the night before Thanksgiving, as the men celebrated in the big house, Esther sat alone in the dark kitchen, holding her mother's knife in one hand and a wooden spoon in the other. She remembered what her mother had taught her: when the time comes, don't flinch. Fire needs feeding. Esther pressed the knife to her chest and closed her eyes. She didn't flinch. The workers, still called slaves by some, moved around the plantation like shadows, their eyes down and their hands quick. Esther Carter stood in the center of the kitchen, calm on the outside, but with a storm brewing inside. The table was set for a grand feast. Silverware shone like sharp knives. Roasted hens were stuffed and laid out, sweet potatoes glazed in molasses, and cornbread stacked high. But at the center of it all was a large brass kettle filled with golden lard, meant to fry the turkey. The men were already drunk before noon. Nathaniel, red-faced and sweating, bragged about his contracts up north. Thomas boasted about teaching freedmen in Mississippi how to behave as though they still had chains. Silas barely spoke, content to observe. His eyes often lingered on Esther as she moved between the dining room and the kitchen. She felt that gaze, the same look Silas gave her when he told her that Clara was gone. Esther moved steadily, each action deliberate, each dish served with care. She poured wine with one hand while stirring the lard with the other. Outside, the sun climbed higher, but inside, the air thickened. When Thomas made a crude joke about Esther cooking the turkey with one of her cousins, the others laughed loudly. Esther didn't flinch. She just returned to the kitchen and added more wood to the fire beneath the kettle. The flames rose, and the oil began to bubble, thick and hot, humming its low song. Nathaniel came into the kitchen first. "Need a hand, old girl?" he sneered, lifting the lid of one pot. "Don't want you keeling over before the meal's done." He reached for the kettle's handle. Esther's hand shot out, her grip firm like stone. Their eyes locked. "You don't touch what you don't understand," she said. For a moment, the kitchen went silent. Even the bubbling oil seemed to pause. Nathaniel chuckled, pulling his hand back. He muttered something about uppity cooks and left the kitchen. Esther returned her attention to the kettle, its contents almost ready. The scent was no longer just from fat and fire. It now smelled like judgment. From the parlor, Silas called, "Esther, bring us the turkey. Let's see what you've done with our bird." Esther didn't answer. She picked up the carving knife, the long fork, and the thick padded gloves. Behind her, the kettle hissed and trembled, the fire beneath it growing more intense. The lard inside swirled like molten gold, thick and bubbling, promising something. Esther stood before the kettle, her back to the door, her face lit by the orange flames. In her hands, she held two things: a long wooden paddle and a memory she couldn't shake. She wasn't thinking of the turkey anymore. She was thinking of Clara. The knife wasn't for carving, it was for reckoning. Everything in the kitchen had become a weapon: the ladles, the skewers, the cast iron skillet she had used as a shield for years. The pantry door creaked open, and Esther glanced back once, noticing the shelf where her mother's old spice jars still sat. Cinnamon, cayenne, asafoetida, things that brought memories rushing back. Silas entered as he always did, no knock, no warning, just his cocky stride and cold smile. He leaned against the doorframe and sniffed the air like a man savoring wine. "Smells like tradition," he said. Esther didn't turn. She just kept stirring the lard slowly. "Where's the turkey, Auntie?" Silas asked. You hiding it under your apron? Esther heard his footsteps behind her. Then there was silence, followed by the sound of him getting closer. He reached to lift the lid of the kettle. In one smooth motion, Esther's wooden paddle cracked across his face with a sound like breaking bone. He staggered back, gasping, hand to his mouth. You broke, he started, but Esther didn't let him finish. She grabbed the thick gloves, took hold of the kettle, and in one strong, practiced motion, tilted it. The boiling lard spilled forward, splashing Silas from the chest down. His scream filled the room, high and sharp, then turned into steam as he dropped, twitching and sizzling. Esther stood over him, eyes wide, chest heaving. The empty kettle still in her hands. One down. Upstairs, Nathaniel and Thomas heard the noise. Chairs scraped, boots hit the floor. Shouts echoed down the hallway. She's lost her mind. Get the rifle. But Esther didn't run. She stepped over Silas's twitching body, grabbed the carving knife, and walked to the pantry. She opened it calmly and pulled out another pot of lard she had hidden hours before, ready for this moment. Before the scream had even finished echoing through the rafters, Nathaniel came barreling down the stairs with a rifle in hand. Thomas followed, holding a fireplace poker, his face pale with fear. Neither of them asked if Silas was dead. They already knew. Esther stood at the kitchen doorway, calm as death itself. Her apron was streaked with lard and blood. Her hands were bare now, the empty kettle beside her. Smoke curled at her feet like it had a purpose. You crazy bitch! Nathaniel roared, raising the rifle, but his hand was shaking. Esther didn't flinch. Put that down, she said softly, or I'll feed you what your brother's tasting now. Nathaniel hesitated. Thomas took a step back. Nathaniel aimed, but the shot went wide, tearing through a shelf of dried beans. Esther moved quickly, slipping behind the cast iron stove. Sparks flew, mixing the smell of gunpowder and grease. Thomas turned to run, but Esther was already on him. She tackled him at the pantry threshold, knocking the poker from his hand. He hit the floor hard. Before he could scramble, Esther slammed the carving knife into the space between his fingers, pinning his hand to the floor. He screamed in pain. You remember Clara? She hissed, inches from his face. He didn't answer, only cried and shook. Esther twisted the knife, her voice breaking. She was 7 and you let them take her. You watched. His eyes bulged in horror. He tried to speak, but Esther twisted the knife harder. I did too, she said, her voice cracking. And I've been tasting that silence ever since. Heavy footsteps approached again. Nathaniel had returned, wielding the rifle like a club. Esther pulled the knife free and rolled aside just as the rifle came down, splintering the pantry floor. She kicked Thomas's knee, breaking it with a sickening crack. He howled in pain. Nathaniel lunged at her. She ducked behind the stove. He followed. Esther grabbed the second pot of lard, cold for now, and smashed it into his face. The edge of the pot caught him across the temple. He dropped the rifle. Blood ran down his cheek. They wrestled. Esther wasn't stronger, but she was precise. She drove her thumb into Nathaniel's eye, biting his arm when he tried to choke her. He shrieked. She kneed him in the groin. When he dropped to his knees, gasping for air, she didn't stop. She grabbed the iron skimmer, flat and wide, and slammed it into his mouth over and over, until his teeth scattered like dry corn on the floor. Finally, silence returned. Both brothers lay groaning on the ground. Esther stood over them, panting, her hair soaked, her arms shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. Esther took one last look around the kitchen, the pots, the ladles, the blood. She whispered softly to herself, "This is the only gratitude I ever owed you." The light in the room had changed. It wasn't the rising sun, still hours from appearing, but the light from the fire. It burned deeper now, a darker orange, like the last glow of a fading star. The scent of burned oil mixed with singed fabric and blistered flesh. It clung to everything from the walls to the floorboards, to under her fingernails. The scream that had split the air moments ago was already swallowed by silence, but its echo lingered in the bones of the house. Esther stood still, her shadow cast on the soot-darkened wall. The kettle, now on its side, lay beside Silas Ruddle's twitching body. The fat had finished its final hiss, and the room had fallen into a deep, almost complete silence. Esther didn't approach him. She didn't need to. The work was done. Silas's face was barely recognizable, the skin on his neck and chest peeling away like parchment over fire, his lips no longer capable of making threats, smirks, or lies. She stepped carefully around him, like stepping over a snake, cautious, but not afraid. She had dreamed of this moment, not in clarity or fantasy, but in rhythm, the same rhythm that pulsed in her hands as she stirred pots over the years, the rhythm that held her up during nights filled with grief, the rhythm her mother had hummed while peeling yams and hiding bruises. It was a rhythm older than rage, a rhythm of return. Nathaniel was the first to react. She heard the gunshot before she saw him, the bullet slamming into the pantry door just inches from her shoulder. The blast rattled silverware and drove the crows from the fields. Instinctively, Esther dropped low, feeling the splinters graze her cheek. Nathaniel, now armed, shouted in a high, cracking voice, "You goddamn witch! What did you do?" But Esther didn't answer. Her eyes were already scanning the room, focusing on what she needed. The long iron skimmer hanging on the wall, the second pot of lard hidden behind the flour sacks, the carving knife still dripping near Thomas's hand. She moved with the grace of smoke, silent and purposeful, leaving only heat behind. Nathaniel burst into the kitchen, rifle raised like a club. His first shot missed, fired in panic. His boots slipped on the oil-covered floor and he stumbled. Esther rose, catching the motion as he swung the rifle toward her. She ducked under the blow, ramming her shoulder into his gut. He grunted and staggered back. Esther grabbed the skimmer and drove it into his mouth. It sounded like splitting melon. Teeth scattered across the floor. He dropped the rifle, clutching his face and howling in pain. Esther didn't stop. She swung the skimmer again, across his cheek, his temple, the base of his neck. The iron bent, then cracked. Blood sprayed in arcs. Nathaniel collapsed beside Silas's body. Thomas, hearing the crash, appeared at the edge of the hallway, looking lost, his hands still bandaged from when she had pinned it with the carving knife. His leg dragged behind him, bent awkwardly. His face was pale, wide-eyed. "Esther," he whispered, but she didn't let him finish. In 3 strides, she crossed the room and punched him in the chest, her palm landing hard against his sternum. He fell backward into the kitchen table, knocking a bowl of candied yams to the ground. The syrup mixed with blood, pooling on the floor. "I remember what you said when Clara was taken," Esther muttered. "You said she was lucky. You said she'd be safer somewhere else. You said I should be grateful." Thomas coughed, blood spilling from his mouth. She grabbed the second pot from the hearth. It wasn't fully hot yet, but it would do. She stepped forward and appended it over his legs. The oil didn't scream like before. It groaned, tired of its task. Thomas screamed, a short, choked sound, but then silence fell again. Outside, dogs barked, and somewhere a gate slammed. The sun still hadn't risen, but the air was thick with the promise of light. Esther stood amidst the wreckage, her hands shaking, not from fear, but from memory. It was done. The house groaned under its own weight. The kitchen, once a place of order and repetition, had become something else, a sanctum, a place of reckoning. The great house, the proud estate of Cypress Bend, had swallowed generations whole, but tonight it had tasted resistance. She could hear the voices rising outside, the workers stirring in the fields, overseers noticing the silence from the house. Men who would rush to avenge what they could never understand. Esther didn't wait. She moved quickly with the discipline of years. She went to the pantry and lifted the loose floorboard she had prepared the night before. Beneath it, she retrieved the satchel she had buried, wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. Inside were a few coins, a broken pendant once worn by her mother, a handkerchief with Clara's initials embroidered in shaking thread, and a strip of cloth stained with the blood from the day her brother was burned. She tied the bag across her back and took one last look at the kitchen. The floor was covered with food, blood, and smoke. The silver serving trays gleamed in the firelight, and the carved roast sat untouched, a grotesque monument to false gratitude. She walked through the parlor, past the portraits of the Rutledge family, past the oak table where her daughter had once been sold, past the grand piano no one knew how to play. The door creaked open with a groan that sounded almost like a sigh. Outside, the air hit her like a second birth, cold, wet, and honest. She moved quickly, heading toward the trees, down the side path, past the old well, through the cane that still smelled of blood and thunder, and into the marsh where only the desperate survived and the faithful endured. Behind her, the house stood still. It would not burn. She had considered that, but no, fire was not her legacy. The silence would be louder. The Rutledge name would not end in flames. It would rot in the minds of those who found what she left behind. The first scream had come from them. The last word belonged to her. The swamp had its own language. It didn't speak in human tongues. It spoke in fog and breath, in the long groan of trees shifting in their ancient beds, in the slap of water against rotted cypress roots, in the rustle of snakes in damp grass, and the hush of birds that had seen too much. Esther moved through it like she belonged. Her bare feet knew where to step. Her eyes caught the smallest signs: mud curling in the wrong direction, reeds parting where no wind had passed. She had walked these woods many times before, not as a fugitive, but as a woman grieving, a woman needing silence, a woman needing to remember. Now, she wasn't hiding. She was returning. Each step carried the weight of names. Names of people no one had written down, of men whose backs were maps of pain, of women who birthed babies in fields and buried them in secret, of children who vanished in wagons taken north or nowhere. Esther whispered their names as she walked: Jonas, Clara, Old Moses, Benta. Each name was like an offering, a drumbeat, a chain pulling tighter with every syllable. Her voice didn't rise above a breath, but in the dark hush of the swamp, it might as well have been thunder. She found shelter in a place no white man would dare go, a raised patch of land, half sunk between two forked oaks. There had once been a hut here, now long gone, collapsed under moss and time, but its bones remained. Esther cleared the space with her hands, moving slowly, reverently, as if she was disturbing a grave. Perhaps she was. She didn't need fire. The swamp was warm enough, and the darkness held no fear for her. Inside, she carried the memory of 3 faces, now twisted, broken, disfigured by oil and iron. Their truth had found them, and that was enough light to see. She sat, knees drawn to her chest, her bag beside her. Her fingers traced the thread of cloth wrapped around her daughter's old handkerchief. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't looking at the trees. She saw the kitchen, the faces of Silas and the others, how their smirks melted when they realized she wasn't afraid. She remembered the sound Silas made, not like a man, but like something broken, undone. She had waited so long for this moment, but it didn't bring peace. Not yet. The next morning, the dogs came. She heard them before she saw them, yelping, panting, growling. The handlers were close behind, men shouting orders, shackles clinking at their belts. They weren't just hunting her. They were hunting the story, desperate to erase it before it spread. They needed to call her mad, dangerous, evil, because they couldn't afford the truth. The truth was what terrified them. But Esther didn't run. She folded the handkerchief carefully, tucked it back into her bag, and stood. Her bones ached. Her feet were swollen. But her spirit was something else now, not just a mother, not just a cook. She was history walking. She left the clearing before the dogs arrived, moving deeper into the water, waist deep, where the snakes watched but did not strike. The cypress roots stretched out like guiding hands, leading her forward, and the names kept coming. She whispered them as she walked: Isaiah, Ruthie, Matilda, Esther. Her name, not as a title but as a verdict. 2 nights later, Esther emerged from the swamp, hidden beneath the Spanish moss and moonlight. A small cabin stood at the edge of the trees, leaning and quiet, a candle flickering in the window. It wasn't safe, nowhere was, but it was known. Inside lived Mother Dina, an old healer who had buried 3 husbands and outlived a dozen masters. No one questioned her age or her wisdom. Some said she had hexed a white man until he lost his tongue. Others said she simply let people poison themselves with their own cruelty. Esther knocked once, and the door opened without a word. Dina looked her over, oil-streaked, barefoot, eyes full of ghosts, and stepped aside. "You finally did it," she said, not as a question, but as a prophecy fulfilled. Esther nodded. "I did." Dina closed the door behind her. The air inside smelled of sulfur and mint, herbs hung from the beams, and a kettle simmered on the stove, not of lard, but something sweeter. Esther sat on a low stool, feeling her limbs like wood, but her chest felt like it could breathe deeper than it ever had. "They'll come looking," Dina said. "They already are," Esther replied. "You ready to keep walking?" Dina handed her a piece of cloth, old, frayed, dark with age and smoke. On it were stitched dozens of names in red thread, some crooked, some barely legible. "Add yours," Dina said. "Ain't no shame in the blood if the hand that spilled it held the truth." Esther took the needle, threading it slowly, and carved her name in red, one letter at a time. 3 days later, they found the bodies. Silas was blistered and bloated, still lying beside the brass kettle, his mouth open as if mid-prayer or curse. Nathaniel had bled into the cracks of the floorboards, his jaw shattered, face swollen beyond recognition. Thomas clung to life for a while longer, but when the doctor arrived from Baton Rouge, he stared at the man, whispered Esther's name once, and slipped into a silence he would never return from. The plantation froze. The laughter stopped. The horses refused the reins. The wind no longer passed through the cane in song. Something had broken inside Cypress Bend. Not a crime, not a scandal, a curse. They sent for Colonel William Rutledge the same day the doctor left. He arrived at dusk, gray-bearded, stiff, smelling of horse and tobacco. His coat was black, his gloves white. He looked at his house as if it were a stranger, like the front porch should bow in apology. No one greeted him. The servants had vanished into the woods. The overseers wouldn't come near the kitchen. He walked in alone, and the house swallowed him. The colonel didn't weep. He stood at the edge of the parlor where Silas used to play cards and drink bourbon he hadn't earned. He walked the hallway where Thomas had carved his initials into the floorboards with a stolen knife. He entered the bedroom where Nathaniel once beat a man until his back looked like river rock. He didn't weep. Instead, he sat in the kitchen, lit a cigar, and stared at the blackened kettle. It still smelled faintly of lard and something deeper. The floor beneath it was scorched. The stone was cracked. Esther's apron lay nearby, folded neatly as if it had resigned. He took a long drag, exhaled into the rafters, and muttered, "She was just a cook. Just a goddamn cook." But the words didn't feel right. They echoed strangely, bounced off the soot-covered walls with weight, with judgment. He knew she hadn't just boiled his sons, she had boiled the lie. The lie of civility, of control, of ownership. The lie that said the kitchen was his domain, that loyalty could be bought with scraps, that quiet meant consent. Esther had taken everything he built and left it scalded in a brass pot. By midnight, the colonel had drunk a full bottle of whiskey. He didn't sleep. He paced. He yelled at the walls. He screamed her name into the parlor, Esther, as if she might walk back in and undo it all. But the house remained still. At 3 a.m., the colonel returned to the kitchen, kneeling before the fire, consumed by Esther's vengeful memory.